we talked about the liver accepting sugar and burning it, right?
Yes.
But let's say you overwhelm the liver too. You keep eating carbs. Can the liver continue to burn sugar indefinitely? It can't. The liver becomes insulin resistant. So in other words, even though your sugars are high and even though your insulin is high, your liver cannot burn sugar. It cannot burn fat because in the presence of high insulin, it cannot burn fat either. So this is metabolic mayhem. So I must tell you, today I was talking to Chana, and I have been here and I keep giving you talks, and sometimes in order to simplify things, I say things wrong. So my concept of what is insulin resistance has changed dramatically over the last few months. So many years or decades of eating refined carbs, you get insulin resistant, and I didn't understand what that meant. So let me see if I can explain that to you. Okay, so this is a situation in which sugar is there, the insulin receptor is functioning well, the sugar gets inside the cells. The cells is where the sugar is needed to make energy. That's it. The cell needs the energy to function well. I used to think that this paradigm was wrong. The reason I felt this paradigm was wrong is I said that there is plenty of sugar, there is plenty of insulin, and the reason the insulin receptor is not working is because the cell is overstuffed. Your cell is overstuffed with nutrients, with sugar, and that's why the insulin receptor is not working. I did not think that there was a problem with the insulin receptor itself. In other words, I had this concept. This concept is wrong. This concept is right. I have promoted this concept saying that, why do you want to eat carbs? Because your cells are already filled with carbs. In fact, I showed this slide. This is a Japanese train. So during rush hour, the Japanese train is full. And the Japanese train police wants to clear the platform, well. So what they do is that even though it is full, they take the passengers and shove them into the train. So I used to blame, and the metaphor is right, but in any way it's mechanistically wrong, and it's important for us to know why it's mechanistically wrong, and that's why I'll tell you. But that's what modern medicine does. The insulin receptor is not working, and modern medicine says, hey, let's just give more insulin to make it work. You just have to make the receptor function well. Okay, so this is very straightforward, so don't get bogged down by it. I have a series of slides that's going to explain to you how insulin works in the body and what insulin resistance is. So here is an insulin receptor. So insulin comes and binds to a receptor. The receptor is on the surface of every cell. So imagine this is a cell. The receptor is sitting out here like this. Insulin comes and binds there. And then when it binds, it starts a series of internal reactions. And the internal reactions, what they do is that they send a channel to the cell surface so that sugar can get in. So basically, when insulin sits on the insulin receptor, a channel is created so that the cell can take sugar for function. Now, insulin is not just confined to taking in sugar. The functions of insulin and insulin receptor is not just confined to taking in sugar. It takes in sugar, which is glucose uptake, but the sugar that it takes, it converts it into glycogen, which is the storage form of sugar. It makes you store and make fat. It's important for your brain function. Now we showed the first slide, right? You increase the sugar, the person can think better. And part of the reason of that is that the insulin is needed to supply sugar to the brain. It does a little bit more than that, and we'll get into that. It also promotes growth, and if this growth is excessive, it can cause cancers. What does insulin receptor and insulin inhibit? When your insulin levels are high, what do they prevent the body from doing? What they prevent the body from doing is making new sugar. We have talked about people who are following a low-carb diet. They're not eating any carbs. But is their body making carbs? It is. And it's making because your insulin levels are low and you can make new sugar through gluconeogenesis. When your insulin levels are high, you cannot break down fat. And when your insulin level is high, the body cannot do autophagy. How many of you guys know what autophagy is? Okay, so autophagy is a very important process by which our cell cleans out junk. So in other words, our cell, if you're constantly eating, accumulates protein junk, fat junk. For you to clear that junk out, you need to have low insulin levels, and that's when autophagy is promoted. So this is a slide again showing that insulin is coming and sitting on the insulin receptor. It's activating sugar intake, and it's making gluconeogenesis or glycogen synthesis, or making new glycogen through a series of chemical reactions. We don't need to fortunately get into those reactions. But here is the fundamentally important point. What happens when you increase insulin levels? As Americans, do we increase insulin levels on a regular basis?
Yes.
And how do we do that?
By eating carbs.
By eating carbs. So when you eat carbs, you increase your insulin level. So let me give you a corollary example. Let's say the opioid crisis in the US is very strong right now. So when the person first takes an opioid drug, takes an opioid, they get a bang-up reaction in pain control, because the opioid goes and sits on the opioid receptors in the brain, and their pain control is very good. Now, if they keep taking opioids, the receptors in the brain through which opioid works, does it go down or it remains the same? It goes down. So what happens is that when they take the same amount of drug, would it cause the same degree of pain relief? No. It will not. You need to take higher and higher doses, because your opioid receptors are getting what is called down-regulated. In fact, the overdose happens because they cannot figure out how much to take. And sometimes they take so much that it causes respiratory depression, they stop breathing, and they don't make it. So if you increase insulin levels, your insulin receptor also gets down-regulated. That is one concept. I mean, I used to think about insulin resistance, but what I didn't understand is that all you need to make your body less responsive to insulin is to just increase your insulin levels. In fact, have it high constantly. How can you have insulin levels high constantly? So your doctor will go and say, hey, I want you to lose weight, so I want you to have 8 small meals every day. What does that do to your insulin levels? They're high all the time. In fact, they are cycling back and forth, which is much better. Now, if you have inflammation and other things, it also reduces the activity of your insulin receptor. So sugar is not internalized. The insulin receptor does not function well, so the body makes more insulin to compensate. Why does it make more insulin? Just like a person who has an opioid addiction, your cell is now starving. It's starving because there are not enough insulin receptors. It cannot take sugar inside. So here it is giving you different methods through which insulin receptor doesn't work. One is that this is proper signaling. The insulin receptor is sitting, but it cannot signal inside the cell. Another way is that the insulin receptor is removed. It's not present on the outside. And the third way is that it is removed and destroyed. Okay? So many things can happen. So this was the example. I didn't know which was the cart and the horse. I didn't know which was the chicken and the egg. But now I know that the hyperinsulinemia, which means high insulin level, is the horse, and the insulin resistance is the cart. When you have high insulin level, it downgrades your insulin receptor, and it reduces the uptake of sugar by the cells. So instead of thinking of modern diet as being too much for your cells, you should think that the modern diet is actually starving you. So now, this is an important concept. Insulin does a variety of different things. When insulin comes and sits here, it not only internalizes sugar, it not only makes glycogen, but it is also increasing fat synthesis, it's also increasing protein synthesis, it's also causing you to have higher risks of cancers. Unfortunately, if you go into literature, you will find that when you get insulin resistance, your cell is starving, you can't take in sugar, you can't make glycogen, but you still make a lot of fat. That's not good, right? And you still are at risk of cancers. All right. So the important concept I want to get into you is that one of the worst things that can happen to you is what is called hepatic insulin resistance, or liver insulin resistant. So when your liver is insulin resistant because you're eating too much fat and also eating too much carbs, the liver is not able to burn the fat. Despite high sugars and high insulin, the sugar cannot get into the cells of the liver and it cannot burn. That's why the fire from the glucose is much lower, and the liver just turns out and starts spewing out fat into your bloodstream that can be bad for you. So again, this is saying the insulin resistant liver does the following things. Cannot burn sugar in the mitochondria, which is the energy of the liver, so it exports a lot of sugar into the bloodstream. So I don't know if you've ever heard about things like the liver sugar output. If you are insulin resistant, your liver sugar output is high because the liver cannot use sugar. It is synthesizing and exporting a lot of VLDL, which is basically fat-filled molecules, which is one of the cholesterol molecules people call it. And our focus should be on the VLDL, not on the LDL. And these molecules just stay in the bloodstream. They cannot be removed because your fat is already filled and your muscles are not responsive. So hepatic insulin resistance is a person who can't use sugar, starts exporting fat. When the liver has insulin resistance, it creates inflammatory mediators. What it does is that it starts making a lot of CRP. How many of you have had your CRP drawn? So your CRP levels go up because the liver is inflamed. In the liver insulin resistant state, what happens to the manufacturing of the coagulation molecules by the liver? So in other words, when the liver is inflamed, when it's insulin resistant, it also pours out a lot of factors that make the blood thick. So you are at risk of heart attacks and strokes because of that. So the question to ask is that why individuals with ApoE4 have higher risk of getting hepatic insulin resistant? The reason is that ApoE4 people, their liver takes up a lot of fat. Since it takes up a lot of fat, they're genetically designed to burn fat. Their biology makes it important for them to clear that fat. And how can you clear that fat? They're designed to do fasting. Exercise is also important in their biology because when you exercise, you create an energy deficit, and they are much less tolerant of the modern diet. And hepatic insulin resistance contributes to an increased risks of heart attacks and strokes in these individuals. So I wanted to circle back and tie the story of ApoE now to the brain, or tie the story of insulin resistance also to the brain. So when you increase the sugar in the normal or in the Alzheimer's brain, you think better. Why is that happening? So I did not know this. The reason it's happening is because when you increase the sugar in the presence of a normal insulin receptor, you internalize more sugar, so the brain has more sugar in it to burn so that it can create memory. But that's not the only thing that insulin is doing, and before we think of insulin being bad, I sometimes think that we should have cyclical insulin levels. That means we should have periods in which the insulin goes up. And I think the best way to do that in modern diet is to eat a little protein. Protein also increases your insulin levels. Because why is it important to increase your insulin level? Because when your insulin is increased, a lot of chemical reactions take place in the brain that make you function better. It forms new memory and cognition. So that's an important part. So here it is showing you an normal brain, insulin receptor working in, taking in the sugar inside, but also creating chemical reactions that will increase memory and the plasticity with which your brain works. Out here is a brain cell with the insulin receptor that is downregulated or internalized. They don't have sugar, and they don't have the insulin to make the proteins and other things that are necessary for memory and cognition. So when your brain is insulin resistant, it is deprived of energy. It cannot clear protein debris. So in other words, protein debris in our brain is called amyloid plaques, and it cannot maintain cell viability. So if you look at a brain of an Alzheimer's disease person, it's actually shrunk in size. It's become smaller. Why has it become smaller? It's become smaller because you can't take any sugar inside the brain. When you can't take sugar, you cannot maintain the viability of the brain. So the brain starts atrophying. So this is the only complicated slide I have, and it's specifically designed for ApoE4 individuals. So we said, so don't look at the slide for a minute, look at me so that you don't get bogged down. So we said that the reason the brain ages is because proteins clump inside the brain. They're called amyloid. So I used to think that amyloid is all bad, but amyloid precursor protein is necessary for our brain cells to function. So as the brain is using amyloid precursor protein, it makes a smaller molecule which is called amyloid beta. So when you make amyloid beta, the amyloid beta is cleared by ApoE. So in other words, the breakdown product of amyloid is cleared by ApoE. So what's showing you here is that here is ApoE3 here and ApoE4 there. The ApoE3 needs to first pick up cholesterol and fat before it can bind to this breakdown product of amyloid. ApoE3 seems to be a little better at clearing it, because what happens is that it comes and binds to the amyloid. It gets cleared by two receptors into the circulation. The amyloid E4, the ApoE4 gets cleared only by one receptor. So if you are insulin resistant, which modern diet would do, and you have ApoE4, you are much less likely to clear the protein debris from your brain, and that's why you get Alzheimer's about 10 years earlier. So why ApoE4 increases risks of dementia and amyloid plaques? Amyloid beta is a breakdown product of protein that is important for brain function. ApoE4 is not as good at clearing amyloid B or beta as ApoE3 is. Another thing I didn't show you is that ApoE4 in the setting of low energy availability, a brain that does not have sugar does not have enough energy. So the ApoE4 breaks up, and when it breaks up, it binds to amyloid beta and promotes the plaques, the amyloid plaques. So a person on a standard American diet who is ApoE4 will get Alzheimer's about 10 years earlier compared to somebody who is ApoE3. It doesn't start when you're older. Even if you take early childhood, you will see that a standard American diet will show that brain utilization of sugar is lower in people who are ApoE4. So that's why I think everybody should get their ApoE, what type they have, measured and take adequate precautions. So why is it important to know if you are ApoE4? We went through some of this. The reason is that you were designed more to eat an ancestral diet. You were designed to do fasting, because fasting is the best way to clear fat, as I will show you. You were designed to be physically more active so that you create an energy deficit. They are more at risk of insulin resistance and unhealthy adipose tissue or fat tissue with the modern diet. They have higher LDL levels, and unfortunately, instead of looking at insulin resistance and instead of looking at VLDL, what modern medicine is doing is that they focus only on the LDL. Why do they focus on the LDL?
Because they have a drug for it.
They can sell medicines for it. They make $40 billion a year. And you can measure the reduction in LDL, but really there is no good way to reduce insulin resistance. There is no money in it. The way to reduce insulin resistance is the old-fashioned way, through nutrition and through exercise and fasting. People who have ApoE4, if they are in this range, they will have a 3 to 4 higher risks of heart disease and 11-fold. Now, one-fold is 100%, or two-fold is 100%. 11-fold is 1100%. 11-fold higher risks of getting Alzheimer's disease. So how can I find out if I'm metabolically healthy? So the way you can find out, and that's what we are doing regularly, is checking the health of your fat cells. If your fat cells are healthy, the fat cells elaborate a hormone called adiponectin level. I don't know if any of you have had that checked. The adiponectin levels are high. How can you find out if you're healthy? Your triglycerides are low. Why are your triglycerides low?
Because you don't have fat in the bloodstream.
Because your fat cells are healthy.
Right.
As soon as you eat fat, it gets packed into the fat cells. Why is your HDL high? Because when you're eating fat, the intestines are making HDL for you so that you can clear the fat, as long as you're not eating too much carbs and as long as you continue to fast. This is called HOMA-IR, which is a measure of how low your insulin is or what level of insulin you need to keep your sugar levels low. Lower HOMA-IR means that you are insulin sensitive, that your blood is not thick, and that you have low inflammation markers. So you want to check all of these to see if you're metabolically healthy, in addition to checking your ApoE4 or ApoE genotype. Why is an insulin-resistant body and brain hungry in the midst of plenty? You have a lot of sugar in your bloodstream. You have a lot of sugar going into your brain, bathing the circulation around your brain.
The receptors are not working.
Why are you hungry? Because you are internally starved. You are internally starved. So, what can I do to prevent insulin resistance? So, what you want to do is that you want to start in the beginning. You want to empty the fat that is collecting in your gut. So we showed that if you don't fast or if you don't exercise, you will collect fat in your gut. So you want to empty the fat cells. I mean, you want to empty the intestinal cells of fat. You want to empty your fat cells. What's the best way to empty your fat cells? Fasting. Low carb diet and exercise. I think in that order. Prevent your liver from becoming insulin resistant. Prevent high insulin levels by not eating too many carbs. But by not eating too many carbs. Cycle your insulin. So I'm changing your mind. I always used to say, hey, keep your insulin levels low. Now, I think there are some of you who are on an OMAD diet. Do you know what an OMAD diet is?
1 meal a day.
1 meal a day diet. Do you think people who are taking an OMAD diet are they insulin cycling?
Yes.
No.
They are.
They are.
Because you eat so much protein that your insulin levels go up. And you should have your insulin levels go up once in a while. Because you want to promote the activities in your brain that improve your cognition, that improve your memory. You want to build muscle mass. You want to make new protein. So I think insulin cycling is important. You know, today me and Chana were seeing a patient who was, I think, taking 100 units of insulin. 100 units. A normal body makes probably on a low carb diet makes about 25 units of insulin. He was taking 100 units of insulin. What do you think his average blood sugar was? Low or high?
225.
How much?
225.
You are right on the dot. So despite the high insulin, his sugar levels were high. And the reason for that is because he was just taking long-acting insulin. What happens when you take long-acting insulin? It's just totally flat. You don't have the cyclical elevations that you need when you eat food. So if the insulin receptors are continually subjected to insulin, they downregulate. So that's the worst. And this is very important. How can you provide an alternative fuel for the brain? If the brain does not have sugar in it, how can you heal the brain? How can you supply an alternate fuel for the brain? You all do it on a regular basis. How do you do that?
Keto.
You make ketones. When you don't eat carbs, when you do fasting, when you exercise when you're fasting, you make ketones and the brain can use ketones quite well. So I thought that was very interesting to me. And